You're not seriously bringing him in here dressed like that, are you? The words landed before Daniel Brooks even made it 3 steps past the glass doors, sharp enough to cut through the low hum of investor chatter and the soft clink of crystal glasses. And for a moment, everything in the room tilted toward him, not because he demanded attention, but because someone with power had just decided he didn't belong. Scarlett Hayes stood near the center of the marble-floored lobby, posture perfect, expression calm in the way that came from never being questioned, her eyes moving once over Daniel's worn button-down shirt, the faded cuffs, the shoes that had seen more years than most of the people in that room would ever admit to, and then down to the small hand gripping his daughter's fingers tightening instinctively as the quiet laughter began to ripple outward in small, controlled bursts, the kind that tried to sound polite but never quite succeeded. Emma Brooks pressed closer to her father's side, her voice barely above a whisper. "Dad, are we supposed to be here?" But Daniel didn't answer, not because he didn't hear her, but because he had already heard something else, something deeper in the room, something beneath the surface noise that most people would miss entirely. The space itself was designed to intimidate, floor-to-ceiling glass reflecting the skyline, tailored suits moving in practiced patterns, conversations about 8-figure deals carried out like they were discussing the weather, and Daniel stood in the middle of it. Like a misplaced detail, something the room had not accounted for. Scarlett took a step closer, heels clicking softly against the polished stone, her voice dropping just enough to feel controlled. "This is a private investor session," she said, not looking at him directly anymore, as if the decision had already been made. "Security will escort you out." And 2 men near the entrance shifted their stance, ready to move, ready to correct what she saw as an error. Daniel's grip on Emma's hand loosened just slightly, not letting go, just enough to reassure her without drawing attention, and he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. Slowly, deliberately, not in defiance, not in panic, just in a way that made time stretch a fraction longer than it should have. And that was when it happened, small at first, almost nothing, a chair scraping softly against the floor somewhere behind Scarlett, followed by another, and then a voice, calm, older, carrying a weight that didn't need volume. "Hold on," it said, and for the first time since Daniel had walked in, Scarlett hesitated, just a fraction, just enough for the room to notice. Because hesitation, in a room like this, was louder than any laugh, and the investors who had been quietly observing, the ones who hadn't joined in, the ones who had been watching Daniel with something closer to recognition than judgment, began to shift, one after another, not rushing, not speaking over each other, just standing, as if responding to something that had already been decided long before this moment. And the laughter stopped, not gradually, but all at once, like a switch had been flipped, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than anything that had come before it, the kind of silence that makes people aware of exactly where they're standing and why. And Daniel, still saying nothing, still not explaining, simply looked up, meeting no one's eyes in particular, yet somehow changing the direction of every single one in the room. And somewhere in that stillness, one of the investors spoke again, quieter this time, but impossible to ignore. "If he leaves," the man said, "we're all walking out with him." Scarlett did not turn immediately, and that was the first mistake everyone noticed, because in a room built on control, the person who delayed a reaction was the one losing it, even if only for a second. And when she finally faced the man who had spoken, her expression remained composed, but her eyes had shifted, sharper now, measuring something she had not needed to measure before. "Excuse me," she said, the word precise, controlled, but no longer dismissive, and the older investor, a man in his late 60s with silver hair and a navy suit that fit like it had been tailored for moments exactly like this, did not raise his voice, did not repeat himself. He simply held her gaze and said, "You heard me." And behind him another chair moved, then another, until 5, then 8, then more investors were on their feet, not rushed, not emotional, just deliberate, as if each one had reached the same conclusion at the same time without needing to discuss it. And the shift in the room was immediate, not loud, not chaotic, but undeniable, the kind of shift that changed the direction of power without anyone announcing it. Emma looked up at her father again. Confusion still there, but something else now, something quieter, a question forming without words, and Daniel finally moved, not away, not toward the exit, but just enough to place himself slightly in front of her, a small adjustment. Almost invisible, yet it changed the way the room framed him, no longer as someone out of place, but as someone choosing exactly where to stand. Scarlett's jaw tightened just enough to register, and she glanced toward the security staff who had paused mid-step, uncertain now, waiting for a signal that did not come, and that hesitation spread outward, touching every person in the room, because no one moved when authority lost clarity. "I think there has been a misunderstanding," Scarlett said, recalibrating, her tone smoothing out, attempting to pull the moment back under control, but the same investor shook his head slightly. "No," he said, "there has not." And the simplicity of it carried more weight than any explanation could have. A younger investor near the back leaned forward, studying Daniel more closely now, eyes narrowing not in judgment but in recognition, and he murmured something to the woman beside him, who immediately straightened, her attention locking onto Daniel with a focus that had not been there before. And within seconds that quiet recognition began to spread, not loudly, not dramatically, but in subtle exchanges, glances, small nods. The kind of communication that happened between people who understood the same thing without needing to say it out loud. Scarlett saw it happening, saw the room moving without her, and for the first time since she had stepped onto that floor, she was no longer the center of it. "If there is a concern," she said carefully, stepping forward now, reclaiming space physically if not yet socially, "we can address it privately." But the older investor gave a small, almost amused breath through his nose. "There is nothing private about this," he replied, and then, after a pause just long enough to let the weight of the moment settle, he added, "You brought him into the room, even if you did not realize it." And the words hung there, unanswered, because no one needed clarification, not anymore. Daniel remained silent, his hand resting lightly on Emma's shoulder now, steady, grounded, and the stillness around him deepened, not awkward, not empty, but focused, as if the entire room had aligned around a point that had been invisible just moments before. And somewhere near the front, another investor spoke, quieter than the first, but with the same certainty. "You should listen before you decide who does not belong here." And that was when Scarlett understood that the moment had already moved past her, that whatever this was, whatever Daniel Brooks represented in this room, it was no longer something she could dismiss, and the realization settled in slowly, not with panic, but with the kind of clarity that came when control slipped just far enough to reveal what had been hidden underneath. The silence did not break all at once. It shifted, tightened, like the air itself had been recalibrated around a truth that only a few people in the room fully understood, and Scarlett Hayes felt it in the way no one moved when she expected them to. No one looked to her for the next instruction. No one laughed anymore, and that absence of reaction said more than anything else could have. She took another step forward, slower this time, controlled, deliberate, as if reclaiming the floor could restore the balance she had lost. "Then perhaps someone would like to explain," she said, her voice steady. But the edge was gone now, replaced by something more careful, more aware, and for a moment no one answered, not because they did not have one, but because the answer itself carried weight, and the room seemed to understand that once spoken, it would change everything. Daniel Brooks did not look at her, did not acknowledge the tension directly. Instead, his attention dropped briefly to Emma, who was watching the room with wide eyes, sensing the shift without understanding it, and he gave her a small nod, the kind that said nothing is wrong without needing to say it out loud, and that quiet reassurance stood in contrast to everything else happening around them. The older investor who had first spoken adjusted his jacket slightly, not out of discomfort, but out of habit, the movement precise, practiced, and then he looked around the room, not at Scarlett, but at the others who had stood with him, as if confirming something without words, and when he spoke again, it was not loud, but it carried. "You are looking at the wrong detail," he said, and that line alone drew every eye back to Daniel, not to his clothes now, not to his presence as an anomaly, but to something else, something beneath the surface that had been there the entire time. A younger analyst near the side table lowered her tablet slowly, her expression shifting from confusion to realization, and she leaned toward the colleague beside her, whispering a name under her breath, a name that traveled quietly, from one person to the next, not repeated loudly, not announced, but passed along like a signal, and each time it reached someone new, their posture changed just slightly, their attention sharpening, their assumptions dissolving piece by piece. Scarlett caught fragments of it, not enough to form a complete picture, but enough to know that something had moved beyond her control, and that realization pressed in, not as panic, but as a slow, steady pressure that demanded she reassess everything she had decided in the last 60 seconds. If there is something relevant, she said, choosing her words carefully now, it should be stated clearly. But even as she spoke, she knew the tone had changed, not commanding anymore, but requesting, and that shift did not go unnoticed. One of the investors closest to Daniel finally turned fully toward him, studying him in a way that had nothing to do with judgment and everything to do with confirmation. And then he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if aligning a memory with what he was seeing now. Daniel remained still, his presence unchanged, his expression calm, neither defensive nor assertive, simply present in a way that made the noise of the room feel unnecessary. And that stillness began to define the moment more than anything else. "You built something most of us rely on," the investor said quietly, not to the room, but to Daniel himself. And that sentence landed differently, not as a reveal, but as a doorway. Something that opened just enough to let the scale of the situation begin to take shape without fully exposing it. And the effect was immediate. The room leaned in without moving, attention tightening around the center point that Daniel had become. And for the first time since the moment began, it was no longer about whether he belonged there, but about why he had ever been mistaken for someone who did not. The words did not echo. They settled, heavy and deliberate. And for a brief second no one moved, as if the room itself needed time to process what had just been said, because it was no longer a question of presence or appearance, it was a question of value. And that shift carried weight that could not be ignored. Scarlett Hayes held her position, but something in her posture had changed, not visibly enough for most people to name it, but enough for those who understood power to recognize that. She was recalculating, her eyes narrowing slightly as she studied Daniel Brooks again, this time not from a distance of judgment, but from a position of forced attention, as if trying to reconcile two conflicting realities at once. "Built what, exactly?" she asked, and the question was controlled, but it no longer carried dismissal. It carried something else now, something closer to caution. The investor who had spoken earlier did not answer immediately. Instead, he glanced briefly toward the others who had risen with him, and that silent exchange passed between them again, confirming that whatever was about to be said was not casual, not accidental, but intentional. And when he finally spoke, his tone remained even. "The system that cleared your last 3 funding rounds," he said. And this time the reaction was not silence. It was recognition, sharp and immediate, a ripple that moved through the room in the form of shifting expressions, straightened postures, quick glances toward one another as pieces began to align. A man near the far end of the table lowered his glass slowly, his brow tightening as he looked at Daniel more closely, and then he nodded once, almost to himself, as if confirming a memory that had just resurfaced. Emma glanced up again, her small voice breaking through the tension in a way that no adult could. "Dad, what are they talking about?" And Daniel placed his hand gently over hers, steady, grounding, his voice calm when he finally spoke. "It is okay," he said. Nothing more, no explanation, no performance, just enough to hold her steady in a room that had shifted around them. Scarlett's gaze did not leave him now, and the space between them felt different, no longer defined by distance or authority, but by something unresolved, something she had not accounted for. And that realization pressed against her control, testing it. "If that is true," she said slowly, choosing each word with precision, "then I would expect documentation, credentials, something that verifies what you are implying." And it was a reasonable demand, structured, logical, an attempt to bring the situation back into a framework she could manage. But the investor's response came without hesitation. "You have already used it," he said, and that line landed with more force than any document could have, because it removed the need for proof and replaced it with consequence. The room reacted again, not loudly, but in subtle ways that mattered. A few investors exchanged looks that carried more certainty now. A woman near the front leaned forward, her attention fully locked on Daniel, and another voice, different this time, spoke from the side. We have all used it. And that addition widened the scope instantly, turning a single claim into a shared acknowledgement. Scarlett's fingers tightened slightly at her side, a small movement, controlled, but not invisible. And for the first time since the moment began, she did not respond immediately, because the situation had moved beyond a simple correction, beyond a quick dismissal, into something that required her to confront the possibility that her initial judgment had not just been wrong, but costly. Daniel remained exactly where he was, unchanged, unhurried, his presence steady in a way that made everything else in the room feel reactive by comparison. And that contrast began to define the space between him and everyone else, not through volume or authority, but through stillness. And in that stillness, the balance of the room continued to shift, inch by inch, away from assumption and toward something far more difficult to ignore. The weight of that statement did not fade. It expanded, filling the room in a way that made every small detail feel sharper, more exposed. And Scarlett Hayes felt it in the silence that followed, not empty, not uncertain, but charged with a clarity she could no longer ignore. She shifted her stance slightly, a subtle adjustment that brought her shoulders back, her chin level, reclaiming composure not through dominance, but through control. And when she spoke again, her voice carried a different tone, measured, deliberate. If what you are saying is accurate, she said, then I would like to understand why none of this has ever been presented through proper channels. And it was a calculated move, an attempt to reposition the situation into something procedural, something she could evaluate and contain. But the response came from a different direction this time. A woman in her early 40s near the front, her posture straight, her eyes steady. Because he does not present, she said. And that sentence landed with quiet precision, followed by a brief pause before she added, he builds, and then he leaves. And that distinction shifted the frame again, not toward credentials or titles, but toward actions, outcomes, results that existed regardless of who took credit for them. A low murmur passed through a few corners of the room, not disbelief, but recognition forming into something more solid. And another investor, younger, leaned forward slightly, his voice careful. The transaction routing system we integrated last quarter, he said, the one that reduced processing time by 40% across our network. And he stopped there, not finishing the thought, because he did not need to. The implication was already clear. Scarlett's gaze moved briefly, connecting the statements, aligning them with what she knew, what she had approved, what she had taken as established infrastructure without question, and the realization began to take shape not as a sudden shock, but as a slow, undeniable alignment of facts that pointed in one direction. Emma shifted her weight slightly, her small hand still in her father's, her voice softer now. Dad, are we in trouble? And Daniel glanced down at her, his expression unchanged, calm, grounded. No, he said simply, and that single word carried more certainty than anything else in the room, because it did not react to the situation, it existed outside of it. Scarlett noticed that. Noticed the way he had not raised his voice, had not defended himself, had not attempted to correct her directly, and that absence of reaction began to feel less like passivity and more like control, a different kind of authority, one that did not need to assert itself to be felt. You are suggesting, she said slowly, returning her focus to the group, that he has contributed to systems currently in use across multiple portfolios without formal acknowledgement. And even as she spoke, the phrasing sounded smaller than the reality it described, and the older investor gave a slight nod. That is one way to say it, he replied, then added. Another way is that you are standing in a building partially funded by decisions made possible because of his work, and that line did not raise in volume, but it expanded in meaning, stretching beyond a single system into something broader, something foundational. The room reacted again, not through noise, but through stillness, the kind that comes when people begin to reassess their own position within a structure they thought they understood. And Scarlett felt that shift fully now, not resisting it, but navigating it, her mind moving quickly, recalibrating, because the stakes had changed, not just socially, but structurally, Daniel remained. Where he was, unchanged, his presence steady, and in that steadiness, the contrast between him and everything around him became impossible to ignore, not because he demanded attention, but because the room had finally learned where to place it, and that realization settled in, layer by layer, until the original question, whether he belonged there, no longer existed at all. The room did not return to normal, it evolved, and that evolution carried a quiet pressure that settled over every conversation that had not yet resumed, because no one wanted to be the first to speak without understanding where they now stood, and Scarlett Hayes recognized that hesitation immediately, not as weakness, but as a signal, a shift in alignment that required a different kind of response. She took a slow breath, not visible, not dramatic, but enough to reset her pacing, and when she stepped forward again, it was not to command the room, but to enter it differently, her voice lower, more focused. "Then I would like to hear it directly," she said, her eyes now on Daniel Brooks, not scanning past him, not dismissing him, but holding him in a way that acknowledged what the room had already begun to accept. For the first time since he had walked in, Daniel lifted his gaze fully to meet hers, and the moment stretched, not tense, not confrontational, but precise, like two people measuring the distance between assumption and reality. And when he spoke, his voice was calm, even, carrying no urgency. "There is nothing to present," he said, and that answer, simple as it was, created a different kind of pause, because it did not follow the structure the room expected. Scarlett did not look away. "Systems do not appear on their own," she replied, and there was no accusation in it now, only a request for clarity, and Daniel gave a slight nod, acknowledging the truth of that. Without expanding on it, "They do not," he said, and then he stopped again, leaving the space open, not filling it with explanation, not offering more than what was necessary, and that restraint drew the room in further, because it suggested that whatever he chose not to say carried more weight than anything he might. An investor near the center shifted forward in his chair, unable to hold back this time. "You built the early version of the adaptive routing model," he said, his tone more certain now, "before it was scaled, before it was renamed," and Daniel glanced briefly in his direction, not confirming, not denying, just acknowledging the statement as something that existed. And that non-response functioned as confirmation in a way words might not have. Emma looked up again, her eyes moving between the adults, trying to piece together something that felt larger than she could understand. "Did you make something important?" she asked, and Daniel's expression softened just slightly, the smallest shift in the entire moment. "I made something that helped," he said, and that phrasing, understated, almost quiet, contrasted sharply with the magnitude the room was beginning to attach to it. Scarlett absorbed that, the simplicity of it, the absence of self-promotion, and it reframed everything she had assumed, because it removed the idea that recognition had ever been the goal, and replaced it with something more difficult to measure. "And you chose not to attach your name to it," she said, not as a question, but as a realization forming in real time, and Daniel did not answer immediately, his attention returning briefly to Emma before he looked back up. "It was not necessary," he said, and that line settled deeper than any claim could have, because it implied a level of detachment from status that the room was not built to understand easily. The older investor gave a small nod, as if that answer confirmed something he had already known, and another voice, quieter, added, "We looked for him." And that admission shifted the narrative again, from accidental discovery to intentional absence, from oversight to choice. Scarlett's posture changed once more, not collapsing, not conceding, but adapting, her shoulders easing just enough to reflect a new calculation, and when she spoke again, the tone had fully transformed, no longer defensive, no longer dismissive. "Then I misjudged the situation," she said, not loudly, not performatively, but clearly enough that no one could mistake it. And the room responded not with applause or relief, but with a deeper stillness, the kind that follows when a correction has been made and everyone understands its significance. And in that stillness, Daniel Brooks remained exactly as he had been from the beginning, steady, quiet, and entirely unchanged, as if the shift around him had simply caught up to something that had been true all along. The admission did not dissolve the tension. It refined it, narrowing the room's focus into something sharper, more intentional, and for the first time since the moment began, no one was reacting to a disruption anymore. They were adjusting to a new center of gravity, one that no longer revolved around Scarlett Hayes, but had settled quietly around Daniel Brooks. Scarlett held her position, but the space between her and Daniel felt different now, not divided by authority, but defined by understanding. And when she spoke again, her voice carried none of the earlier edge, only clarity. "Then I would like to correct that," she said, and the statement was simple, but it carried intent, not for the room, but for him. Daniel did not respond immediately, and that pause, small as it was, held weight, because it was not hesitation, it was consideration, the kind that came from someone who did not need to answer quickly to maintain control of the moment. Emma shifted slightly beside him, her grip loosening now, the tension in her shoulders easing as the room itself seemed to settle into something calmer, and she looked up again, this time with a different question. "Are we staying?" she asked, and Daniel glanced down at her, then back up at the room, taking in the faces that had shifted from dismissal to attention, from noise to silence, and then he nodded once. "For a minute," he said, and that answer, understated, almost casual, landed with quiet authority, because it implied that the choice to remain was his. A subtle reaction moved through the investors, not visible to anyone not looking for it, but present in the way a few of them straightened slightly, the way one man adjusted his stance, as if preparing for something more formal, and the older investor who had first spoken gave a faint nod, as if acknowledging a decision that mattered. Scarlett noticed it, noticed how the room aligned not with her words now, but with Daniel's presence, and she adapted again, stepping slightly to the side rather than forward, creating space instead of taking it. "There is an open seat," she said, gesturing toward the long table behind her, and it was not an order, not even a request, it was an invitation, carefully positioned, measured, and the difference was not lost on anyone. Daniel looked at the chair briefly, then back at Scarlett, and the moment stretched again, not tense, but deliberate, because what happened next would define the direction of everything that followed, and instead of moving immediately, he reached into his jacket again, slowly, the same controlled motion as before, and this time he removed a small, folded document, not thick, not formal in appearance, just a single piece of paper, worn slightly at the edges, and he held it for a second before extending it toward the nearest investor rather than Scarlett. The man accepted it without question, unfolding it carefully, his eyes scanning the contents, and as he read, his expression shifted, not dramatically, but enough to register, and he passed it to the person beside him, who did the same, and within seconds the document began moving through the small group of standing investors, each one taking just long enough to confirm what they were seeing before handing it off. Scarlett watched this unfold, her attention fixed, her expression composed but focused, and when the paper finally reached her, she took it, her fingers steady, her eyes moving across the lines with precision, and as she read, the room did not speak, did not move, because everyone understood that whatever was on that page was not being introduced, it was being recognized. Emma leaned slightly closer to Daniel, her voice softer now. "What is it?" she asked, and Daniel rested his hand lightly on her shoulder again, his answer, quiet. "Just something I kept," he said, and that simplicity contrasted with the weight the room was beginning to place on it. And when Scarlett finished reading, she did not look up immediately. She held the paper for a moment longer, as if aligning what she saw with everything she had just learned, and then, slowly, she raised her gaze back to Daniel Brooks, and this time, there was no trace of dismissal left at all, only understanding, and something else, something closer to respect, forming in real time. Scarlett Hayes did not speak right away, and that silence carried more meaning than anything she could have said, because the document in her hand was not just information, it was confirmation, the kind that removed all remaining doubt without needing explanation. And as her eyes moved across the final line, something in her posture settled into a new alignment, not defensive, not performative, but precise, as if she had recalibrated her understanding of the entire room in a matter of seconds. She folded the paper carefully, not rushing, not dramatizing the motion, and then extended it back toward Daniel Brooks, not through an assistant, not through an intermediary, but directly, closing the distance that had defined the beginning of the moment. And when he took it, the exchange was quiet, almost unremarkable on the surface, but the shift it represented was unmistakable. "You should have been introduced properly," she said, her voice even, controlled, but now carrying a weight that had not been there before, and the room absorbed that statement not as a correction of etiquette, but as a recognition of position. Daniel did not respond immediately, his attention briefly dropping to the folded paper before he slipped it back into his jacket, the same place it had been when he walked in, and that simple action reinforced something the room was beginning to understand, that nothing about him had changed, only their perception of him had. Emma looked between them again, her voice quieter now, more curious than uncertain. "Does that mean we are supposed to be here?" she asked, and Daniel rested his hand lightly on her shoulder, grounding, steady. "We always were," he said, and that answer, simple as it was, settled into the room with a clarity that no formal statement could match. A few of the investors exchanged glances, not confused, but acknowledging, as if that single line had captured the entire shift more effectively than anything else could have. Scarlett held Daniel's gaze for a moment longer, not as a challenge, not as a test, but as an acknowledgement, and then she turned slightly, addressing the room without raising her voice. "We will proceed," she said, and the phrasing was deliberate, not restarting, not correcting, but continuing, as if the moment had not interrupted the session, but clarified it. The investors began to move again, chairs sliding back into place, conversations resuming in low, measured tones, but the energy was different now, more focused, more aware, and every movement carried a subtle awareness of what had just happened. The open seat at the table remained unoccupied for a second longer than expected, and then one of the investors nearest to it stepped aside slightly, creating space without drawing attention. And Daniel glanced at it once more before guiding Emma forward with a small, steady motion, not rushed, not hesitant, just enough to indicate that the decision had been made. As they moved, the room adjusted again, not dramatically, but in small, meaningful ways, people straightening, conversations quieting just a fraction, attention shifting without appearing to, and when Daniel reached the table, he did not take the most prominent position, did not claim space beyond what was offered. He simply sat, placing himself within the structure without altering it, and Emma settled into the chair beside him, her feet not quite touching the floor, her eyes moving across the room with a quiet curiosity that mirrored the attention now directed toward them. Scarlett returned to her position at the head of the table, but the distance between her and Daniel no longer felt like a divide. It felt like a line of connection, one defined not by authority, but by recognition. And as she began to speak again, outlining the agenda in the same clear, structured manner as before, the room listened differently, not because her words had changed, but because the context around them had. And in that context, Daniel Brooks remained exactly as he had been from the start, calm, quiet, and entirely present. The center of a shift that had already rewritten the balance of the room, without him ever needing to say more than a few words. The meeting did not return to what it had been. It moved forward into something quieter, more precise, as if every person in the room had adjusted their sense of scale, and Scarlett Hayes felt that shift in the way each investor now listened with a different kind of attention, not just to her, but to the space around the table, to the presence that had redefined it without announcement. She moved through the agenda with the same clarity she had always carried, outlining projections, timelines, strategic positioning. But the tone had changed, not in her delivery, but in the weight each word held, because the room was no longer operating on assumption, it was operating on awareness. Daniel Brooks did not interrupt, did not interject. He simply listened, his posture steady, his attention fixed, and when a chart appeared on the screen behind Scarlett, detailing projected efficiency gains over the next 2 fiscal quarters, a subtle pause moved through a few of the investors, not visible to anyone who was not looking for it, but present in the way their eyes shifted briefly toward Daniel before returning to the display. Emma sat quietly beside him, her small hands folded on the table, her gaze moving between the screen and the people around her, absorbing the moment in a way that only someone outside the structure could, and after a minute, she leaned slightly closer to her father, her voice soft but clear enough to carry to him. Is that what you made better? And Daniel glanced at the screen, then back at her, his expression unchanged. Part of it, he said, and that answer, simple and restrained, landed with quiet impact, because it framed the entire presentation as something that extended beyond what was being shown. Scarlett caught that exchange, not fully, but enough to understand its implication, and she adjusted mid-sentence, not stopping, not calling attention to it, but refining her language, shifting from ownership to attribution, from declaration to acknowledgement. The system has evolved through multiple contributions, she said. And the phrasing was deliberate, a subtle correction that aligned the narrative with the reality the room had already accepted. One of the investors near the center leaned forward slightly, his voice measured when he spoke. There is an assumption built into these projections, he said, that the current model remains static, and he paused just long enough for the weight of that statement to settle before adding. But it has not been static before. And the implication was clear, not a challenge, but a recognition of pattern. Scarlett did not deflect, did not dismiss. She turned her attention toward Daniel, not directly asking, but opening the space. And the room followed that shift, every line of attention converging without a word being spoken. Daniel looked at the data once more, then at Scarlett, and for the first time since he had sat down, he leaned forward slightly, not to take control, but to engage, his voice calm. Even, it adapts, he said, and that statement, brief as it was, reframed the entire model, not as a fixed system, but as something dynamic, something that required understanding rather than assumption. The room absorbed it instantly, not as new information, but as clarification, and Scarlett gave a small nod, acknowledging the shift without needing to elaborate. Then we will adjust the framework accordingly, she said. And the decision carried through the room without resistance, because it aligned with what they now understood. Emma looked up again, her voice softer now, almost thoughtful. So they needed you, she said, and Daniel's answer came just as quietly. They needed the work, he replied, and that distinction settled into the moment with a finality that required no further explanation, because it captured everything that had changed, not just in the room, but in the way each person in it now understood value, contribution, and presence. And as the meeting continued, moving forward with a new alignment that had not existed an hour before, the balance remained steady, not because it had been forced, but because it had been revealed. And in that balance, Daniel Brooks remained exactly what he had been from the beginning, not defined by the room, but quietly redefining it without ever needing to claim the center he now undeniably held.